touched my girlfriend's hand, and she filed a restraining order. 3 nights ago, I reached across the table at Olive Garden to hold Jenna's hand during our anniversary dinner. She yanked it away like I'd burned her and started crying. Everyone in the restaurant turned to stare as she ran to the bathroom. When she came back 10 minutes later, her eyes were puffy and she wouldn't look at me. She said we needed to leave immediately. In the car, she was silent the whole ride home, then went straight to her sister's place without explaining anything. The next morning, I woke up to 15 missed calls from her brother Tyler. He said Jenna told the whole family I'd been physically aggressive with her at dinner and she didn't feel safe anymore. I tried explaining I'd literally just touched her hand like I'd done 1,000 times before, but Tyler said I was minimizing what happened and hung up on me. By noon, Jenna had changed her relationship status to single and posted something vague about finally standing up for herself. Her friends were commenting hearts and saying how brave she was. I kept texting, asking what was happening, but she never responded. 2 days later, a process server showed up at my apartment with restraining order paperwork. The document said I'd grabbed her aggressively in public, causing bruising and emotional distress. There was no bruising because I'd barely touched her wrist for maybe 2 seconds. But the papers also mentioned a pattern of controlling behavior, including monitoring her finances and limiting her access to money. That part confused me because Jenna had full access to her own accounts, plus I'd been paying most of our bills for 2 years since she quit her job to focus on her jewelry business. Yesterday, her friend Becca reached out asking if I was okay. She said Jenna had been acting weird lately and something didn't add up. Then Becca forwarded me a text conversation she'd had with Jenna from last week. In the messages, Jenna was asking Becca if she knew any lawyers who could help get a settlement from an ex. Jenna specifically mentioned needing at least $50,000 to cover some debts she hadn't told me about. Becca had replied saying that sounded sketchy, and Jenna should just talk to me about money if she needed help. Jenna's response was that I was too controlling about finances and would never agree to give her that much. Which was strange because I'd never once told her no when she needed money for anything. After seeing those texts, I started piecing things together. 6 months ago, Jenna's jewelry business started getting orders from some company in Nevada. She was excited about finally making real money, but never showed me the actual payments. She just said they were reinvesting everything back into materials and equipment. Around the same time, she started being protective of her phone and taking calls in her car. She said it was just business stuff that would bore me. Then 3 months ago, her cousin Keith moved back to town. Keith had always been trouble with gambling issues and constantly borrowing money from family. Jenna started hanging out with him a lot, saying he needed support getting back on his feet. She'd come home late from helping him with job applications or apartment hunting. I noticed our joint savings had some big withdrawals, but Jenna said it was for jewelry supplies bought in bulk to save money. Last month, things got weirder. Jenna started picking fights about tiny things like how I loaded the dishwasher or which way I faced my shoes by the door. She'd get dramatically upset, then document our arguments in a notebook. When I asked why she was writing everything down, she said her therapist recommended it for processing emotions. But she'd never mentioned seeing a therapist before. The week before our anniversary dinner, she kept trying to get me to admit I had anger issues. She'd say things like, "Remember that time you raised your voice when the internet went out, or how you slammed the car door that one time?" I thought she was just stressed about her business. Now I realized she was building a case. After Becca sent those texts, I called my bank to check my accounts. The joint savings we'd built up over 2 years was down to almost nothing. Jenna had transferred $5,000 just 2 days before our anniversary dinner. The transaction history showed multiple transfers to an account I didn't recognize starting 3 months ago, right when Keith came back. The transfers matched the dates she said she was buying jewelry supplies. I also found out the Nevada company ordering jewelry doesn't exist. The website she showed me was registered to Keith's email address. This morning, Jenna's lawyer contacted me about negotiating a settlement to drop the restraining order. They said Jenna was willing to move forward without pressing charges if we could reach a financial agreement that compensated her for her pain and suffering. The suggested starting point was $50,000. I sit in my apartment staring at the settlement letter. My hands shake with anger at the nerve of demanding exactly the amount Becca's texts mentioned. The lawyer's letterhead looks official and expensive. Jenna's already spending money she doesn't have on this whole scheme. I grab my phone and take photos of everything. The restraining order paperwork, Becca's forwarded texts, the settlement letter with that $50,000 number. I photograph every page twice to make sure the images are clear. My phone's camera roll fills up with evidence. I email copies to myself and save them to 3 different cloud storage services. If something happens to my phone, I need backups of everything. The documentation feels like the only control I have right now. I spread the papers across my coffee table and stare at them until the words blur together. Sleep doesn't come that night. I keep replaying the Olive Garden scene in my head, trying to figure out when Jenna decided to destroy everything we built together. Monday morning arrives and I call my bank before the sun comes up. The fraud specialist answers on the third ring. Her name is Jane and she sounds tired but professional. I explain the situation as calmly as I can manage. My girlfriend filed a false restraining order, and I just discovered she's been taking money from our joint account without telling me. Jane asks me to hold while she pulls up my account information. The hold music is some generic jazz that makes my anxiety worse. She comes back on the line and confirms she can see the account. I tell her about the transfers to Keith's account and how they match up with when he moved back to town. Jane walks me through the process of freezing the joint account right away. She explains that both account holders need to agree to unfreeze it, which means Jenna can't access the remaining money. The freeze takes effect immediately. Jane provides documentation of all transfers from the past 6 months. She emails me a detailed statement while we're still on the phone. I watch the email arrive in my inbox. The pattern jumps out immediately once I see all the transactions listed together. Small transfers at first, $200 here, $350 there, then increasingly large amounts as time went on, $1,500, $2,800, $5,000. Every single transfer goes to the same external account. Jane highlights the receiving account number and routing information. She confirms the account belongs to Keith Crawford, based on the name attached to it. My stomach turns seeing the total amount transferred. Over $40,000 gone from our savings in just 3 months. Jane tells me something I didn't know. I can file a police report for unauthorized transfers since Jenna moved money without my knowledge for purposes unrelated to household expenses. She explains that joint account holders have equal access, but using funds for personal gain without the other person knowing crosses into fraud territory. Jane emails me a complete transaction history with dates and amounts and receiving account information. Every detail documented in black and white. I thank her and hang up. Then I spend 2 hours organizing everything into a timeline. I create a spreadsheet with columns for date and amount and what Jenna claimed the money was for and what it actually funded. The correlation between Keith's return and the missing money becomes impossible to ignore. He moved back to town on March 15th. The first suspicious transfer happened on March 18th. Every transfer after that increases in size and frequency. The dates she said she was buying jewelry supplies in bulk match perfectly with when money moved to Keith's account. The fake Nevada business website was registered on March 20th. Everything connects once I lay it out visually. I print 3 copies of the timeline and highlight the key dates in yellow. I reach out to Alec from work through text message. He's been through a difficult divorce 2 years ago and mentioned having a good lawyer who helped him. My text explains the basics without going into too much detail. Alec calls me back within 5 minutes. He sounds concerned and asks if I'm okay. I tell him I'm hanging in there, but I need legal help fast. Alec immediately offers to connect me with his attorney. He warns me not to respond to any communication from Jenna or her lawyer without legal representation. Everything I say can be twisted and used against me in court. Alec learned that lesson the hard way during his divorce. His ex-wife's lawyer took casual text messages and made them sound threatening in front of the judge. He tells me to document everything, but don't engage directly with Jenna or her legal team. Alec texts me his attorney's contact information while we're still talking. His support means more than he knows since I've been feeling completely isolated. Most of our mutual friends sided with Jenna immediately after her social media post. The comments calling me abusive and controlling still sting, even though I know they're based on lies. Alec is one of the few people who bothered to ask for my side of the story. He says he'll put in a good word with his attorney and tell him to expect my call. I call the attorney number Alec sent over. The receptionist answers and I explain that Alec Houston referred me. She transfers me to Jarrett Campbell's office. Jarrett picks up and his voice sounds confident and direct. I give him a brief overview of the situation. False restraining order, fabricated abuse claims, missing money from joint account, text messages showing premeditation. Jarrett asks me to come in for a consultation that afternoon. He specializes in defending against false restraining orders and handles fraud cases. His office is downtown in a building I've driven past 100 times. I arrive 30 minutes early because I can't sit still at home anymore. The waiting room has leather chairs and legal magazines I don't read. Jarrett calls me back at exactly our scheduled time. His office has floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with law books. He sits behind a large desk and gestures for me to sit across from him. I hand him the folder I prepared with all my documentation, bank statements, text messages from Becca, photos of the restraining order, my timeline spreadsheet. Jarrett reviews everything carefully without rushing. He takes notes on a yellow legal pad. After 20 minutes, he looks up and tells me this is one of the clearest cases of restraining order abuse for financial gain he's seen in his 15-year career. The documented planning through Becca's texts is damning evidence. The correlation between the fake business and missing money shows clear fraud. Jarrett's confidence gives me hope that I'm not crazy for thinking this whole thing is a setup. He explains that false restraining orders for financial extortion happen more than people realize, but usually there's not this much concrete evidence. Jarrett explains our legal strategy in detail. We need to respond to the restraining order in court within 10 days. Missing that deadline means the temporary order becomes permanent by default. Simultaneously, we'll file a police report for the financial fraud. He says the two cases will support each other. The fraud motive undermines Jenna's credibility on the restraining order. If we can show she had financial reasons to fabricate abuse claims, then the judge will question everything in her petition. Jarrett asks me to walk him through our entire relationship. Every detail matters because Jenna's lawyer will try to find incidents to twist into a pattern of controlling behavior. We spend 3 hours going through everything. How we met at a friend's party, our first date at an Italian restaurant, moving in together after a year, her decision to quit her job and start the jewelry business, my support of her career change, our normal daily routines, arguments we had and how we resolved them. Jarrett takes detailed notes about our financial arrangement. I paid most bills while she built her business. She had full access to her own accounts plus the joint account. I never monitored her spending or demanded receipts. Jarrett says that contradicts her claims of financial control. He asks about the arguments she documented in her notebook. I describe the fights she picked over tiny things, dishwasher loading, shoe placement, normal couple disagreements that she blew out of proportion. Jarrett explains that manufactured arguments won't hold up without corroboration from witnesses. I rack my brain trying to remember anything that could be misinterpreted as aggressive behavior. Jarrett needs to know the worst possible things Jenna's lawyer might bring up. I tell him about times I raised my voice, getting frustrated in traffic when someone cut me off, yelling at the TV during football games when my team lost, slamming the car door once when I was running late for work. None of these incidents were directed at Jenna personally. Jarrett writes everything down and says that's actually important. Her claim of a pattern of controlling behavior needs specific incidents. General frustration with life circumstances isn't the same as aggression toward a partner. The manufactured arguments from her notebook won't hold up without someone else witnessing them. Our apartment building has thin walls. If I was actually yelling at Jenna regularly, the neighbors would have heard. Jarrett plans to get statements from neighbors confirming they never heard fighting or shouting from our unit. He asks about physical affection in our relationship. I describe how we held hands constantly, hugged goodbye every morning, cuddled on the couch watching movies, kissed in public without any hesitation. That pattern of normal affection contradicts her claim that I grabbed her aggressively at Olive Garden. Jarrett says the contrast between our history and her current allegations will be powerful in court. Tuesday afternoon, we go to the police station together. Jarrett wants to be present when I file the report to make sure everything is documented properly. We meet with Detective Colin Watkins in a small interview room. Colin is a middle-aged guy with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He takes the financial fraud seriously once he sees the bank records and text messages. Jarrett presents everything in a clear timeline. The fake Nevada business, the transfers to Keith's account, Becca's texts about needing $50,000, the settlement demand for that exact amount. Colin asks detailed questions about my relationship with Jenna and when things started changing. I walk him through the timeline again. Keith's return, the behavioral changes, the picked fights and documented arguments, the Olive Garden incident and restraining order. Colin explains that extortion through false legal claims is a felony. Using the court system to threaten someone into paying money meets the legal definition. The documented planning makes it worse because it shows premeditation. Colin says he'll need to interview Becca as a witness since her texts are crucial evidence of premeditation. He takes copies of all our documentation and opens an official case file. The case number gives me a small sense that the system is finally taking this seriously. Colin warns that the investigation will take time, but he'll move as quickly as possible given the restraining order hearing deadline. Jarrett makes a phone call from the police station parking lot. He's hiring Georgia Walden, who's a private investigator specializing in financial fraud cases. Her job is to trace where the money went after it left our joint account and document Keith's gambling debts. Jarrett explains that proving Keith's financial desperation strengthens our case. If we can show he owed money to dangerous people, then Jenna's motivation for the scheme becomes even clearer. Georgia answers and Jarrett puts her on speakerphone. Her voice sounds sharp and professional. She asks me basic questions about Keith. Full name, last known address, places he might gamble. I tell her what I know from Jenna's stories. Keith had gambling problems for years. He owed money to various casinos. Family members stopped lending to him after he never paid anyone back. Georgia says she has connections with casinos and bookmakers that might show Keith's financial desperation. She's worked similar cases before. Jarrett asks how long the investigation will take. Georgia warns that gathering solid evidence will take at least 2 weeks. She needs to pull records and interview people and verify information. 2 weeks feels like forever when the restraining order hearing is coming up fast. Jarrett assures me that we have enough evidence to proceed even without Georgia's findings. Her investigation will just make our case stronger. I have to tell my parents what's happening. They'll eventually hear about the restraining order through family connections or social media. Better they hear the truth from me first. I drive to their house after leaving Jarrett's office. My mom answers the door and immediately knows something is wrong from my expression. We sit in their living room and I explain everything. The Olive Garden incident, the restraining order, the missing money, the fake business, the settlement demand. My dad's face turns red with anger. He wants to confront Jenna's family and demand they make this right. I explain that any contact could be used against me. The restraining order prohibits me from contacting Jenna directly or indirectly through other people. If my dad confronts her family, Jenna's lawyer will claim I'm violating the order through a proxy. My mom cries and asks what she missed. Were there warning signs she should have seen? I tell her this isn't her fault. Jenna fooled everyone, including me. My parents ask what they can do to help. I tell them their support is enough. Just believing me means everything when so many people immediately assumed I was guilty. My dad writes me a check to help with legal fees. I try to refuse, but he insists. Family helps family, he says. My mom makes me promise to call them every day with updates. Explaining everything to them is exhausting, but their support helps me feel less alone in this fight. The next morning, Jarrett calls with an update on the hearing schedule. The court set the restraining order hearing for 2 weeks from now, which gives us time to prepare a solid defense. He explains that having 2 weeks is actually better than getting rushed into court next week because we can gather more evidence and build a stronger case. Jarrett files a motion to dismiss the restraining order based on lack of evidence and includes all the text messages from Becca showing Jenna's financial motive. The judge will review our response before the hearing, which plants early doubts about Jenna's story. Jarrett sounds confident when he explains that judges see false restraining orders often enough to recognize the warning signs. The timing of the settlement demand matching Becca's texts is a huge red flag that undermines Jenna's credibility before we even get to court. He tells me to keep documenting everything and avoid any contact with Jenna or her family no matter what happens. Any violation of the restraining order, even accidental, could destroy our case. I spend the rest of the morning organizing all my evidence into folders on my computer and making backup copies on a flash drive. The bank statements show clear patterns of unauthorized transfers. The screenshots of Becca's texts prove premeditation. The fake Nevada business website shows the whole scheme was planned. Having everything organized makes me feel slightly more in control of this nightmare. My phone rings around noon, and it's Georgia calling with her first investigation findings. She sounds all business as she walks through what she discovered about Keith's financial situation. Keith owes approximately $85,000 to various creditors, including 2 casinos in the next state over, and someone she describes carefully as a private lender, which I understand means loan shark. Georgia explains that the timeline shows his debts got much worse, starting about 6 months ago after what her casino contacts called a very bad gambling streak. He lost over $30,000 in a single weekend trying to win back previous losses. This explains why Keith needed money so desperately, and why $50,000 from me would only partially solve his problems. Georgia says the loan shark has been pressing Keith hard for payment, with threats that escalated from phone calls to in-person visits at his apartment. She has documentation of the threats, and the timeline matches exactly when Jenna started hanging out with Keith constantly. The desperation in Keith's situation made him dangerous and willing to manipulate his own cousin into committing fraud. Georgia promises to have a complete written report ready in 3 days with all the documentation and witness statements. Her findings give us concrete proof of motive, which strengthens our case significantly. I go to work that afternoon trying to maintain some kind of normal routine, even though my mind keeps racing through everything happening. My coworkers definitely notice something is wrong because I keep spacing out during conversations and forgetting what I was doing. Alec covers for me when I need to step outside to take calls from Jarrett or Georgia. He tells people I'm dealing with a family emergency, which is technically true in a horrible, twisted way. Around 3, my boss notices my distraction and pulls me aside into his office. He asks if everything is okay and whether I need some time off. I give him a brief explanation about the false restraining order and the legal situation without going into all the details. My boss surprises me by being really supportive instead of worried about how this affects my work. He says to take whatever time I need for legal appointments and court dates. He also mentions that he had a friend go through something similar years ago, so he understands how stressful false accusations can be. His support means more than he probably realizes, because I was worried about losing my job on top of everything else. Knowing my boss has my back lets me focus on fighting this without constantly worrying about my career falling apart too. That evening, Becca reaches out again through a careful text message, asking if she did the right thing by forwarding those texts from Jenna. I call her back immediately to thank her for coming forward with evidence that might save me from this whole scheme. Becca admits she's been feeling guilty about Jenna because they were friends for years, but she knows what Jenna planned was completely wrong. She says she almost didn't forward the texts because she worried about betraying a friend's confidence. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that letting me get extorted for $50,000 would be worse than any friendship loyalty. I explained that her evidence might be the difference between proving the truth and having a false restraining order on my record forever. Becca agrees to give an official statement to Detective Watkins about the conversation and texts. She sounds nervous about getting more involved, but determined to do the right thing. We talk for almost an hour, and she shares more details about Jenna's behavior over the past few months that seemed off. Jenna had become secretive and defensive whenever friends asked about her relationship with me or her jewelry business. She stopped inviting people over to our apartment and always wanted to meet elsewhere. Becca thought maybe we were having relationship problems, but now realizes Jenna was hiding the planning stages of her scheme. The next afternoon, Detective Watkins interviews Becca at the police station, and she provides even more context than I knew about. Apparently, Jenna had asked several other friends about getting money from an ex-boyfriend before she settled on this specific approach. 2 other friends refused to help her find a lawyer because they recognized it as a shakedown attempt. One friend told Jenna directly that making false accusations was illegal and immoral, but Jenna kept shopping around for someone who would help until she found a lawyer willing to take her case. Becca's statement establishes that multiple people knew about Jenna's financial scheme before she filed the restraining order. This proves the whole thing was planned and premeditated rather than a genuine fear response. Detective Watkins says having multiple witnesses who can testify about Jenna's planning makes the criminal case much stronger. He's building a case for conspiracy to commit extortion, which carries serious penalties. The detective also mentions that Jenna's lawyer might not have known about the fraud aspect when he took her case. If the lawyer believed her story about abuse, he was just doing his job. But now that evidence of fraud is coming out, the lawyer might distance himself from Jenna quickly to protect his own reputation. Georgia calls me 2 days later with another major discovery about the fake Nevada jewelry business. She traced the website creation date back to just 4 months ago and found 0 legitimate sales or customer reviews anywhere online. The domain registration and hosting are both paid for with Keith's credit card, which proves he was directly involved in creating the fake business. Georgia dug deeper and found all the product photos on the website are stock images downloaded from free photo websites. She can trace each image back to its original source, proving nothing on that site is real. The business address listed on the website is actually a UPS store mailbox that Keith rented 3 months ago. There are no business licenses filed in Nevada for Jenna's jewelry company, no tax records, no vendor accounts, nothing that would indicate an actual functioning business. Georgia's investigation proves the whole jewelry business was a front designed to justify transferring money from our joint account to Keith. She has documentation for everything, including screenshots of the original stock photos and records from the mailbox rental. This evidence completely destroys any claim that the transfers were for legitimate business purposes. That same afternoon, Jarrett receives a call from Jenna's lawyer trying to negotiate the settlement amount down to $35,000 as what he calls a good faith compromise. Jarrett puts him on speakerphone so I can hear the conversation. The lawyer sounds less confident than in his first contact and starts with a lot of careful language about finding a reasonable solution. Jarrett cuts him off and states clearly that we're not negotiating any settlement amount. We're seeking full dismissal of the restraining order, plus filing criminal charges for fraud and extortion. The lawyer sounds genuinely surprised that we have solid evidence supporting our position. He tries to backtrack, saying his client may have been mistaken about some details of what happened. Jarrett responds that being mistaken about bruising and controlling behavior while simultaneously demanding exactly $50,000 shows clear intent to defraud. The lawyer gets quiet and says he needs to consult with his client before any further discussion. Jarrett tells him we'll see him in court and ends the call. After hanging up, Jarrett explains that the lawyer's attempt to negotiate down the amount proves they're getting worried about their case falling apart. A confident plaintiff doesn't immediately offer a 30% reduction in settlement demands. I spend the weekend going through old photos and messages from my relationship with Jenna, looking for evidence of our normal, happy times together. My phone and computer have hundreds of pictures of us smiling and holding hands and being affectionate at restaurants and concerts and trips we took. Every photo contradicts her claims of living in fear and being controlled. There are texts from her saying she loves me and thanking me for supporting her jewelry business dreams. Messages about planning our future together and looking at engagement rings. Screenshots of her posting happy couple photos on social media with captions about how lucky she is. I organize everything chronologically to show the progression of our relationship right up until a few weeks before the Olive Garden incident. Jarrett reviews all the photos and messages and says there'll be powerful evidence in court. The documentation shows a completely different relationship than what Jenna is claiming. No woman who genuinely fears her partner posts loving messages and happy photos consistently for 2 years. The contrast between her social media presence and her legal claims makes her story look manufactured and false. Georgia tracks down Haley Browning, who was Jenna's roommate 3 years ago before I even met her. Haley agrees to meet with Georgia and share information about Jenna's past behavior. What Haley reveals makes my stomach turn. Jenna tried something similar with a previous boyfriend named Dustin, threatening to claim harassment unless he paid her $10,000. Dustin was going through a difficult time financially, and Jenna knew he had recently received an inheritance from his grandmother. She started picking fights with him and documenting their arguments just like she did with me. When Dustin tried to break up with her, she threatened to go to his employer and family with harassment claims unless he gave her money to go away quietly. Dustin paid the $10,000 rather than fight the accusations because he couldn't afford a lawyer and didn't want the drama affecting his job. Haley says she tried to talk Jenna out of it at the time, but Jenna insisted Dustin owed her for wasting 2 years of her life. The fact that the tactic worked apparently taught Jenna she could use false accusations as a money-making scheme. Haley is willing to testify in court about the previous incident and provide text messages from that time showing Jenna's planning. This revelation that Jenna has done this before completely changes how I see our entire relationship. Sitting in my apartment that night processing Haley's information makes me feel sick about how badly I missed the signs. I keep wondering what I overlooked or ignored that should have warned me Jenna was capable of this kind of manipulation. Jarrett calls to check on me and reminds me that con artists are skilled at appearing trustworthy and genuine. They study people and learn exactly what to say and how to act to gain trust. I shouldn't blame myself for believing someone I loved and built a life with. But I still feel foolish for not seeing through her act, especially knowing she practiced this scheme on someone else. Jarrett says that's exactly what Jenna counted on. She knew I trusted her completely and would never suspect her of planning something this calculated and cruel. The people closest to us have the most power to hurt us because we give them access to our lives and hearts. I tell Jarrett I understand logically, but emotionally I'm struggling with feeling like an idiot who got played. He says those feelings are normal and will take time to process, but right now we need to focus on winning in court. Once the legal battle is over, I can work through the emotional aftermath with a therapist. For now, I need to channel the hurt into determination to expose the truth and protect myself from further harm. Detective Watkins called Jarrett 3 days later, saying he'd brought Keith in for questioning about the financial transfers. I drove to the police station to wait outside during the interview, even though I couldn't be in the room. Watkins said Keith showed up with his usual cocky attitude, acting like he had nothing to hide. The detective started by asking about his relationship with Jenna and why she'd been transferring money to his account. Keith claimed the money was legitimate payment for helping Jenna with her jewelry business. He said he'd been handling supply orders and managing her online store for a cut of the profits. Watkins asked him to provide documentation of these business arrangements like contracts or invoices. Keith said everything was done informally since they were family and trusted each other. Then Watkins pulled out Georgia's investigation report showing the Nevada company didn't exist and the website was registered to Keith's email address. Keith's face went pale and he stopped talking. Watkins asked him directly if he'd created a fake business to justify taking money from our joint account. Keith demanded a lawyer and refused to answer any more questions. Watkins told me afterward that Keith's refusal to cooperate actually helped our case by making him look guilty. An innocent person would have explanations and documentation ready. Keith's immediate decision to lawyer up suggested he knew the business was fake and couldn't defend the transfers. My phone rang while I was driving home from the police station. Tyler's name showed up on the screen and my stomach dropped. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't ready for another hostile conversation. But something made me pick up. Tyler's voice sounded different this time, less angry and more uncertain. He said he'd been thinking about the situation and some things didn't add up. Tyler remembered all the times he'd seen me with Jenna over the past 2 years, and I was always gentle and patient with her. He'd never witnessed any controlling behavior or angry outbursts. Tyler admitted their whole family had been worried about Keith's influence on Jenna for months. Their parents noticed she started acting secretive and distant after Keith moved back. Tyler said he didn't want to believe his sister would lie about something this serious, but the evidence I'd shared with the detective made him question her story. He stopped short of saying he believed me completely, but his doubt about Jenna's version of events felt like progress. Tyler asked if I'd be willing to talk to their parents eventually, because they were struggling with not knowing what to believe. I told him I appreciated the call, and I'd think about meeting with them once the legal stuff was settled. After we hung up, I felt a weird mix of relief and sadness. Relief that at least one family member was questioning Jenna's lies. Sad that it took overwhelming evidence for anyone to consider I might be telling the truth. Jarrett scheduled 3 practice sessions to prepare me for the restraining order hearing. We met at his office after work, and he grilled me with hostile questions for 2 hours each time. He warned me that Jenna's lawyer would try to make me seem aggressive or controlling. They'd twist innocent moments into evidence of abuse. Jarrett played the role of her lawyer and asked things like why I monitored the joint account so closely if I trusted Jenna. why I paid most of the bills if I wasn't trying to control her financially, why I got upset about small things like internet outages if I didn't have anger issues. The first practice session was rough because I got defensive and tried to over-explain everything. Jarrett stopped me and said I needed to stay calm and factual, answer the question directly without getting emotional or providing unnecessary details. We practiced again and again until I could respond without my voice shaking or my face getting red. By the third session, I felt more in control. Jarrett taught me to pause before answering hostile questions and to redirect when they tried to twist my words. He reminded me that the judge would see through obvious manipulation tactics if I stayed composed. The preparation helped me feel less terrified about testifying. I still worried about screwing up, but at least I had strategies for handling aggressive questioning. Georgia finished her investigation report and delivered it to Jarrett's office. The document was 40 pages of detailed evidence showing a clear pattern of financial fraud. She'd documented Keith's gambling debts totaling $85,000, including specific amounts owed to 2 casinos and a loan shark. The report included copies of threatening letters Keith received from creditors demanding payment. Georgia traced every transfer from our joint account to Keith's personal account with dates and amounts. She'd found text messages between Keith and Jenna discussing how much money they needed and when to make the transfers. The report included screenshots of the fake Nevada business website with proof that Keith registered and paid for the domain. Georgia interviewed 3 of Keith's former roommates who confirmed his gambling problems and desperate financial situation. She'd even tracked down a casino employee who remembered Keith getting banned for trying to use counterfeit chips. Haley's testimony about Jenna's previous extortion attempt was documented with supporting text messages from 3 years ago. Jarrett read through the entire report and said it was some of the most thorough documentation he'd seen in a case like this. Every claim was backed up with multiple sources of evidence. The report made it impossible to believe Jenna's story about legitimate business expenses. Georgia had connected every dot showing this was a planned scheme to steal money and then extort more through false accusations. 3 days before the hearing, Jarrett called saying Jenna's lawyer filed an emergency motion. They claimed I'd been harassing his client by investigating her background and hiring a private investigator. The motion said this investigation was intimidation meant to silence a domestic violence victim. They wanted the judge to order me to stop all investigation activities immediately. Jarrett said this was a desperate move because they knew our evidence was strong. He filed a response within an hour, explaining that legitimate investigation for legal defense is not harassment. Defendants have the right to gather evidence to defend themselves against false accusations. The investigation uncovered fraud and extortion, which proved the restraining order was filed in bad faith. Jarrett included examples from case law, showing courts consistently protect the right to investigate claims. The judge denied their emergency motion the same day, without even scheduling a hearing. Jarrett said the quick denial indicated the judge was already skeptical of Jenna's claims. Judges take emergency motions seriously and only deny them immediately when they're obviously without merit. The denial was a good sign heading into the restraining order hearing. It showed the judge wasn't automatically believing everything Jenna's lawyer filed. I felt a small surge of hope that maybe the truth would actually matter in court. I couldn't sleep as the hearing got closer. I'd lie in bed running through worst-case scenarios in my head. What if the judge believed Jenna anyway despite all our evidence? What if I lost my temper on the stand and proved her point about anger issues? What if they granted the restraining order and I had a permanent record of being an abuser? My mind spiraled through every possible disaster until I was staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. Alec called one night after I texted him that I was freaking out. He talked me through my anxiety for over an hour. Alec reminded me that the evidence was overwhelmingly on my side. We had bank records, text messages, witness testimony, and a detailed investigation report. Jenna had vague claims with no corroboration and a clear financial motive. He said even if the worst happened and the judge made a mistake, we could appeal with all this evidence. But he didn't think that would be necessary because the truth was too obvious. Alec told me to focus on what I could control, which was staying calm and factual during testimony. Everything else was out of my hands. His steady confidence helped quiet some of the panic. I still felt anxious, but not completely paralyzed by fear anymore. The night before the hearing, I spread all the documentation across my living room floor and reviewed everything one final time. Bank statements showing $43,000 in unauthorized transfers. Text messages between Jenna and Becca discussing getting $50,000 from an ex. Georgia's 40-page investigation report with evidence of Keith's debts and the fake business. Haley's statement about Jenna's previous extortion attempt. Photos of us looking happy together throughout our relationship. The contrast between Jenna's fabricated story and the documented reality was stark. She claimed I was controlling and abusive, but the evidence showed I'd been paying her bills and giving her money freely for 2 years. She claimed to be terrified of me, but stayed in the relationship and never mentioned fear to anyone. She claimed the Olive Garden incident was aggressive, but had no real bruising, and immediately started demanding money. I felt sad looking at the old photos of us together. We'd had good times, and I genuinely loved her. But I also felt angry that she chose this destructive path instead of just asking for help with whatever financial trouble she was in. If she'd come to me honestly about Keith's debts or her own money problems, we could have worked something out. Instead, she decided to steal from me and then try to extort even more by destroying my reputation. The anger helped push away the sadness as I packed everything into folders for court. The restraining order hearing took place in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse. I arrived 30 minutes early with Jarrett, and we sat on a bench outside waiting to be called. Jenna showed up 15 minutes later with her lawyer. She wouldn't make eye contact with me when they walked past. She looked nervous and kept whispering to her lawyer while clutching a folder against her chest. We were called into the courtroom and took seats at separate tables. The judge was a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She reviewed the case file with a skeptical expression that made her mouth turn down at the corners. The courtroom felt tiny with just the judge, both lawyers, Jenna, me, and a court reporter present. The judge asked if both sides were ready to proceed. Jenna's lawyer stood and said yes. Jarrett stood and confirmed we were ready. The judge explained the hearing would determine whether the temporary restraining order should become permanent. She said she'd hear testimony from both parties and review all submitted evidence before making a decision. My hands were sweating and I wiped them on my pants under the table. Jarrett had prepared me for this, but actually being in the courtroom made everything feel more real and terrifying. Jenna testified first, and her lawyer walked her through the Olive Garden incident. She described reaching across the table to hold her hand during our anniversary dinner. Jenna claimed I grabbed her wrist aggressively and squeezed hard enough to cause pain. She said she tried to pull away, but I held on for several seconds before she finally yanked free. Her lawyer showed photos of faint marks on her wrist that could have been from anything. The marks were barely visible even in the photos. Jenna claimed she'd been afraid of me for months due to my controlling behavior with money. She said I monitored every dollar she spent and questioned her purchases. She described my angry outbursts over small things like traffic or sports games. Jenna claimed these outbursts made her feel unsafe even though I never directed anger at her. Her testimony sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced specific phrases. She used words like pattern of control and emotional abuse that sounded like they came from a legal website. When her lawyer asked for specific examples of controlling behavior, Jenna's answers were vague. She couldn't name exact dates or provide details beyond general claims. The judge took notes, and her skeptical expression never changed. Jarrett stood for cross-examination and pulled out a folder of photos from our relationship. He asked Jenna about specific happy moments shown in the pictures. There was one from a beach vacation where we were holding hands and laughing. Another from her birthday party where I had my arm around her waist. Jenna struggled to explain why she stayed with someone she feared for 2 years. She said she hoped I would change, and she didn't want to give up on the relationship. Jarrett asked why she never mentioned feeling afraid to any of her friends or family members before filing the restraining order. Jenna said she was ashamed and didn't want people to judge her. Then Jarrett brought up the text messages with Becca, discussing getting $50,000 from an ex. He read the messages out loud, including Jenna's specific mention of needing that amount for debts. Jenna claimed the texts were taken out of context. She said she was just venting to a friend about financial stress and didn't actually plan to demand money from me. Jarrett asked why she mentioned getting the money from an ex, rather than asking me directly if we had such a good relationship. Jenna's explanation was vague and unconvincing. She stammered something about not wanting to burden me, but it made no sense given her other testimony. The judge leaned forward and asked Jenna directly why her lawyer's settlement offer matched the exact amount from those text messages. Jenna went pale and said she didn't know, that her lawyer handled those details. The judge made another note and her expression showed clear doubt. Jarrett stood and approached the bench with a folder of bank statements. He laid out the transaction history showing every transfer from our joint account to Keith's personal banking information. The judge leaned forward to examine the documents, while Jarrett explained the pattern of unauthorized withdrawals starting 3 months ago. Jenna's lawyer objected, saying the transfers were for legitimate business purposes, but the judge overruled and asked Jenna to explain. She claimed the money went to buy jewelry supplies in bulk, and Keith was helping her get better deals through his connections. The explanation sounded weak, even as she said it. Jarrett asked why a jewelry business would need to transfer money directly to her cousin's personal account instead of paying vendors. Jenna stammered something about Keith handling the transactions for her to save time. The judge interrupted and asked for any documentation of these supposed business expenses, like receipts or invoices. Jenna's lawyer shuffled through his papers and admitted they didn't have any receipts because Jenna said she lost them during a recent move. The judge's expression showed clear disbelief as she made another note. The bailiff called me to the witness stand, and I felt my legs shake as I walked forward. The oath felt heavy as I swore to tell the truth. Jarrett started with easy questions about our relationship history and how we met through mutual friends at a party 2 years ago. I described our normal interactions, including holding hands during walks, hugging goodbye in the mornings, and being affectionate at restaurants dozens of times. He showed the judge photos from our relationship, where we were clearly comfortable with physical contact. I explained the joint account was meant for shared household expenses like rent and groceries, not for secret transfers to family members. Describing the Olive Garden incident made my throat tight as I remembered the confusion and fear when she ran crying to the bathroom. I told the judge I had no idea what caused her reaction, since I'd touched her hand the same way hundreds of times before. Jarrett walked me through the timeline, starting with Keith's return to town and the suspicious withdrawals that matched dates Jenna claimed to buy supplies. I described how her behavior changed over those 3 months with the phone secrecy and late nights supposedly helping Keith with job applications. The manufactured arguments about tiny things and her notebook documentation felt sinister in retrospect. When Jarrett asked about my reaction to the restraining order, I said I was shocked and terrified because the accusations were completely false. Jenna's lawyer stood for his cross-examination with a smug expression that made my stomach turn. He asked why I felt the need to track our joint account so closely if I wasn't trying to control Jenna's spending. I explained I only checked the account after receiving the settlement demand for exactly $50,000, which matched the amount in Becca's text messages. Before that, I'd trusted Jenna completely and never questioned her purchases. He tried to suggest I was financially controlling by pointing out I paid most of our bills. I responded that Jenna had full access to her own personal accounts, plus her business account, and I'd never once told her no when she needed money for anything. The lawyer asked if I ever got angry about money, and I said the only time I was upset was discovering $40,000 missing from our joint savings. He tried to twist that into proof of my anger issues, but it fell flat. When he asked why I hired a private investigator to look into Jenna's background, I said it was normal legal defense after being falsely accused and threatened with extortion. The lawyer had no good response to that and sat down looking frustrated. Jarrett called Becca to the stand, and she looked nervous but determined. He asked her to describe the text conversation where Jenna asked about getting money from an ex. Becca pulled out her phone and read the messages out loud, including Jenna's specific request for lawyer recommendations who could help with a settlement. She testified that Jenna mentioned needing at least $50,000 for debts she hadn't told me about. When Becca suggested just talking to me about money problems, Jenna responded that I was too controlling with finances to give her that much. Becca said this confused her because I'd always seemed generous, and Jenna never mentioned financial control before. Jarrett asked when this conversation happened, and Becca confirmed it was 6 days before our anniversary dinner at Olive Garden. The timeline established clear premeditation. Jenna's lawyer tried to discredit Becca by suggesting she was biased in my favor, but Becca said she'd been Jenna's friend for 5 years and only came forward because the plan was obviously wrong. Her testimony about multiple friends being asked to help find lawyers strengthened the evidence of calculated planning. The judge asked Becca directly if Jenna seemed afraid of me during their friendship, and Becca said absolutely not, that we always seemed happy together. Georgia took the stand wearing a professional suit and carrying a thick folder of documentation. Jarrett asked her to describe her investigation findings, and she laid out everything methodically. She testified that Keith owed approximately $85,000 to various creditors, including casinos and loan sharks. The debts accelerated dramatically 6 months ago after a bad gambling streak. Georgia presented records showing the fake Nevada jewelry business website was created 4 months ago using stock photos and Keith's credit card for domain registration. She traced every transfer from our joint account to Keith's personal account and showed they matched the dates Jenna claimed to be buying supplies. The total amount transferred was $43,000 over 3 months. Georgia explained that legitimate businesses would have vendor invoices, shipping records, and inventory documentation, none of which existed for Jenna's supposed jewelry supply purchases. The judge asked several questions about the website registration and seemed particularly interested that Keith paid for it rather than Jenna. Georgia confirmed the website had 0 legitimate sales or customer reviews, despite claiming to be an established business. Her professional presentation and detailed documentation made the fraud obvious. Jenna's lawyer tried to suggest Georgia was biased because I paid her, but she responded that her job was to find facts regardless of who hired her, and the facts clearly showed a fraudulent scheme. Haley walked to the stand and introduced herself as Jenna's former roommate from 3 years ago. Jenna's lawyer immediately objected to her testimony, but Jarrett argued it was relevant to establish a pattern of behavior. The judge allowed it over the lawyer's protests. Haley described living with Jenna and witnessing her relationship with a previous boyfriend named Dustin. She testified that relationship ended when Jenna threatened to file harassment charges unless Dustin paid her $10,000. Haley said she tried to talk Jenna out of it because the harassment claims weren't true, but Jenna insisted she needed the money for credit card debt. Dustin paid rather than fight the accusations because he was worried about his job. Haley explained she'd felt guilty about not stopping Jenna back then, and when she heard about my situation through mutual friends, she contacted my lawyer. Jarrett asked if Jenna showed any signs of actual fear or abuse in that previous relationship, and Haley said no, that Dustin was a gentle person who Jenna seemed to manipulate. The similarity between that situation and mine was striking. Jenna's lawyer objected again, saying this was character assassination, but the judge said it was relevant evidence of a pattern. Haley's testimony established that Jenna had successfully used false accusations for money before, which apparently taught her the tactic could work on a bigger scale. The judge announced a 15-minute recess to review all the evidence. Everyone stood as she left the courtroom. I sat back down, feeling drained from testifying. Jarrett squeezed my shoulder and said the evidence presentation went as well as he'd hoped. Jenna and her lawyer huddled in the corner, whispering urgently. She looked pale and kept shaking her head at whatever he was saying. Becca came over and asked if I was okay. I thanked her again for coming forward because without those text messages, everything would have been much harder to prove. The 15 minutes felt like an hour. When the bailiff called us back, the judge entered with a stern expression that made my heart pound. She stated that after reviewing all testimony and documentation, the evidence overwhelmingly suggested the restraining order was filed in bad faith as part of a financial extortion scheme. My breath caught as she continued. The judge said Jenna's claims of abuse were not credible, given the lack of corroborating evidence and the clear financial motive established through multiple witnesses. She dismissed the restraining order entirely effective immediately. Then she ordered Jenna to pay my legal fees as compensation for the frivolous filing. The judge also announced she was referring the case to the prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges of fraud and extortion. Jenna started crying, and her lawyer tried to object, but the judge cut him off, saying her decision was final. Walking out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight felt surreal. The weight I'd been carrying for weeks lifted so suddenly I almost felt dizzy. Jarrett shook my hand and said the judge's decision to award legal fees and refer for prosecution was significant because it showed she believed the evidence of fraud was strong. He explained the criminal referral meant the prosecutor would review everything for potential charges against both Jenna and Keith. I thanked him for believing me and fighting so hard when everything seemed hopeless. Jenna and her lawyer left through a side exit without speaking to anyone. She kept her head down and moved quickly to avoid eye contact. I pulled out my phone and called my parents immediately. My mom answered and I told her the restraining order was dismissed and the judge ordered Jenna to pay my legal fees. She started crying with relief and called for my dad to pick up the other phone. They both said they were so proud of me for standing up for the truth. My dad's voice cracked when he said he knew I was innocent all along. We talked for 10 minutes while I stood on the courthouse steps feeling the sunshine on my face. Other people walked past, going about their normal days, while mine had just completely changed. I felt grateful for everyone who believed me and supported me through the nightmare. The next morning, Detective Watkins called while I was making coffee. He said the prosecutor's office received the judge's referral and was reviewing the case for criminal fraud and extortion charges against both Jenna and Keith. The process would take several weeks as they built their case by interviewing witnesses and examining all the documentation. Watkins explained the restraining order dismissal, and the judge's specific finding of bad faith filing strengthened the criminal case significantly. He asked me to provide copies of everything we'd presented in court to support the prosecution. I said I'd send everything that afternoon. Watkins mentioned that cases with this much documented planning and clear financial motive usually resulted in charges being filed. He warned me the criminal process would take months to fully resolve, even if charges were filed quickly. I asked what kind of penalties Jenna and Keith might face if convicted. Watkins said extortion and fraud charges could carry prison time, though first offenses often resulted in probation and restitution requirements. He also said Keith would face separate charges for the unauthorized account transfers. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and I took notes on everything he said. Knowing the prosecutor was reviewing criminal charges felt like validation that what happened to me was serious and wrong. That afternoon, I met with Jarrett to discuss filing a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen money. He explained this would be separate from any criminal case and could take months to resolve through the court system. We were suing both Jenna and Keith since they both benefited from the fraudulent transfers totaling $43,000. The lawsuit would also seek damages for emotional distress and harm to my reputation from the false accusations. Jarrett said we could ask for compensation beyond what the judge ordered for legal fees. He walked me through the process of filing the complaint and serving both defendants. I asked how long it might take, and he said civil cases typically take 6 months to a year, depending on whether they tried to fight it or agreed to settle. Given that the restraining order was already dismissed with findings of fraud, he thought they might settle relatively quickly to avoid a trial. We spent 2 hours drafting the complaint with specific details about each fraudulent transfer and the manufactured abuse allegations. The document requested full restitution of the $43,000 plus $25,000 in damages for the emotional harm caused by their scheme. Jarrett said he'd file it with the court tomorrow, and we'd have the defendants served within a few days. Having a plan to recover the stolen money made me feel more in control after weeks of feeling helpless. 2 days after the civil lawsuit was filed, Tyler called me around 8 in the morning. His voice sounded different from the last time we talked, quieter and less angry. He asked if we could meet for coffee that afternoon to talk about everything that happened. I agreed, and we met at a place near his apartment. Tyler looked tired when he walked in, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He sat down across from me and immediately apologized for how he reacted when Jenna first told the family about the restaurant incident. He said he felt terrible for not hearing my side before assuming I was guilty. Tyler explained that his parents were devastated when they found out what Jenna had done. The whole family had trusted her story completely, and now they felt foolish for not asking more questions. He told me their parents cut off all financial support to Jenna until she takes full responsibility for what she did. They were particularly angry about Keith's involvement, since they'd warned Jenna for years that he was bad news. Tyler said Keith was now banned from all family events and gatherings. His apology helped more than I expected, because being immediately labeled as guilty by her whole family had hurt almost as much as Jenna's betrayal itself. Tyler stayed for an hour, and we talked about how the whole situation unfolded. He admitted there were signs something was off with Jenna, but nobody wanted to believe she was capable of something this calculated. Before he left, Tyler said he hoped we could stay in touch because he respected how I handled everything legally instead of trying to get revenge. Over the next few days, word spread through our mutual friend group about what really happened. My phone kept buzzing with messages from people I hadn't heard from in weeks. Sarah texted to apologize for the harsh comments she left on Jenna's social media posts supporting her. Mark called to say he always thought the story seemed weird, but didn't want to be the guy who doubted a woman reporting abuse. 3 other friends sent similar messages, admitting they felt uncomfortable with how quickly everyone believed Jenna without any evidence, but they stayed quiet because they didn't want to seem insensitive. I understood their initial reactions, even though it stung that nobody reached out to hear my perspective before choosing sides. What mattered now was that they were willing to acknowledge the truth and apologize. A few people who had been especially vocal in supporting Jenna just quietly unfriended me on social media, rather than admit they were wrong. I noticed their profiles disappearing from my feed and realized some people would rather avoid accountability than have an awkward conversation. The apologies from friends who did reach out felt genuine, though, and several said they learned an important lesson about waiting for evidence before jumping to conclusions. 3 weeks after the restraining order was dismissed, Watkins called to give me an update on the criminal case. The prosecutor's office had finished reviewing all the documentation and decided to file formal charges against both Jenna and Keith. They were being charged with conspiracy to commit extortion and financial fraud, which carried potential prison time, though Watkins said first offenders usually got probation and restitution instead. He explained that the documented planning through text messages and the fake Nevada business made the case particularly strong. Haley's testimony about Jenna trying the same scheme with a previous boyfriend 3 years ago also helped convince the prosecutor this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Keith was facing additional charges for the unauthorized account transfers since he'd been moving money without my knowledge or consent. Watkins said the prosecutor felt confident about getting convictions or plea deals given how much evidence we'd gathered. He warned me the criminal process would take months to fully resolve with court dates and possible trials. I asked what would happen if they were convicted, and Watkins explained they'd likely face 3 to 5 years probation, community service requirements, mandatory restitution payments, and possibly short jail sentences depending on the judge. The news that charges were actually being filed felt validating after weeks of people questioning whether what happened to me was really that serious. The same week the criminal charges were filed, Jarrett got a call from Jenna's civil lawyer asking about settlement options. They wanted to avoid going to trial on the lawsuit I'd filed to recover the stolen money. The lawyer offered to have Jenna return $30,000 immediately if I agreed to drop the entire lawsuit. Jarrett told me about the offer during our meeting at his office. He said we shouldn't accept their first proposal because we had an extremely strong case and could likely win much more at trial. The fact they were offering to settle so quickly meant they knew they'd lose if it went to court. Jarrett recommended we counter with a demand for full restitution of the $43,000 stolen from our joint account, plus $25,000 in damages for the emotional harm and reputational damage from the false accusations. I agreed with his strategy, and he sent the counteroffer that afternoon. 2 days later, Jenna's lawyer called back and agreed to $40,000 total paid in monthly installments over 6 months. Jarrett said this was a good outcome because it guaranteed I'd recover most of my money without spending a year in court proceedings. I spent the next few days thinking about whether to accept the settlement or push for more money. Part of me wanted to reject it and take them to trial just to make Jenna face more consequences. But Jarrett sat me down and explained the practical realities. A trial could easily take a full year with court delays and scheduling issues. My legal fees would continue piling up during that time, even though I'd already won the fee award from the restraining order hearing. If we went to trial and won, I might get the full amount plus damages, but the extra money wouldn't be worth another year of my life consumed by this nightmare. The settlement guaranteed I'd get $40,000 back relatively quickly through the payment plan. Jarrett reminded me that Jenna would also be paying criminal restitution on top of the civil settlement, so she'd be facing financial consequences for years. I realized he was right about wanting this to end. The money mattered, but getting my life back mattered more. I told Jarrett to accept the settlement offer because I needed to move forward instead of staying trapped in this situation for another year. A few weeks after we accepted the settlement, Watkins called with news about the criminal case. Keith's lawyer had approached the prosecutor about a possible plea deal. Keith was willing to testify against Jenna in exchange for reduced charges and a lighter sentence. The prosecutor was seriously considering the offer because Keith's testimony about how they planned the whole scheme together would make the case against Jenna even stronger. Keith could describe conversations about setting up the fake business, creating the manufactured arguments, and timing the restraining order to maximize settlement pressure. His cooperation would essentially guarantee a conviction if Jenna tried to fight the charges at trial. Watkins asked how I felt about Keith potentially getting a lighter sentence for cooperating. I told him I was okay with whatever approach got justice done. If Keith's testimony helped ensure Jenna faced consequences for what she did, then I could accept him getting probation instead of jail time. What mattered most was that both of them were held accountable through the legal system, even if that meant one got a slightly better deal for cooperating. 2 months after the charges were filed, both Jenna and Keith accepted plea deals to avoid going to trial. Jenna pleaded guilty to attempted extortion and fraud charges. The deal gave her 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and required her to pay restitution for the money stolen plus court costs. The plea agreement included a requirement that she admit in open court that she fabricated the abuse allegations specifically for financial gain. Keith pleaded guilty to fraud charges and received similar probation terms plus mandatory participation in a gambling addiction treatment program. Both of them would have felony convictions on their records permanently. Jarrett explained that the plea deals were pretty standard for first-time offenders in fraud cases, though the requirement for Jenna to publicly admit she lied was unusual and significant. The prosecutor had pushed for that condition specifically because false accusations of abuse harm real victims by making people more skeptical of legitimate claims. I felt satisfied with the outcome, even though part of me wished they'd faced harsher penalties. At least they were being held accountable and would carry these convictions for the rest of their lives. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning 6 weeks after they entered their guilty pleas. I wasn't required to attend, but Jarrett suggested I go for closure. Walking into the courtroom felt strange after everything that had happened. Jenna sat at the defense table with her lawyer looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. Keith sat separately with his own lawyer. The judge called Jenna's case first and asked if she understood the terms of her plea agreement. Jenna's voice shook when she confirmed she understood. Then the judge asked her to state for the record what she had done. Jenna admitted she filed a false restraining order claiming abuse that never happened because she needed money to cover debts. She said she fabricated incidents and manipulated the legal system for financial gain. Hearing her say those words out loud in court validated everything I'd been through. The judge spent several minutes lecturing Jenna about how serious false accusations are and how they make it harder for real abuse victims to be believed. She talked about the damage done not just to me, but to the entire system designed to protect people from actual harm. Jenna cried through the whole lecture, but I couldn't tell if she was genuinely sorry or just sorry she got caught. The judge formally imposed the sentence terms and warned Jenna that any violation of probation would result in jail time. Keith's sentencing was shorter with similar warnings about completing his treatment program. The week after the sentencing hearing, I scheduled my first appointment with a therapist who specialized in trauma from betrayal and false accusations. Sitting in her office felt awkward at first because I'd never been to therapy before. She asked me to describe what happened, and I walked through the whole timeline from the Olive Garden incident to the sentencing. The therapist helped me understand that what Jenna did reflected her own character flaws and desperation, not any failure in my judgment or worth as a person. We talked about how betrayal by someone you trusted deeply creates a specific kind of trauma that affects your ability to trust others going forward. She said my response to the situation, gathering evidence and working through legal channels instead of seeking revenge, showed emotional maturity and integrity. Over the next several sessions, we worked on rebuilding my capacity to trust people without becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone's motives. The therapist helped me separate the legitimate hurt and anger I felt from the urge to let this experience make me bitter toward relationships in general. She explained that healing meant acknowledging the pain while not letting it define how I approached future connections with people. My parents invited me over for dinner on a Sunday evening about a month after the sentencing. We sat around their kitchen table and talked for hours about everything that had happened over the past several months. My dad admitted he'd wanted to handle things by confronting Jenna and her family directly when it first happened. He said watching me take the legal route instead taught him that sometimes the system works when you trust it and follow proper procedures. My mom got emotional talking about how scared she'd been that the false accusations would destroy my life and reputation. She said she was incredibly proud of how I handled the situation with integrity, even when it would have been easier to just pay Jenna off to make the problem disappear. Both of them emphasized that they never doubted my innocence for a second. Having their unwavering support throughout the ordeal had been crucial to getting through it without falling apart. My dad raised his glass and toasted to justice and truth prevailing over lies. We spent the rest of the evening talking about normal family stuff, which felt wonderful after months of every conversation being dominated by legal drama. Driving home that night, I felt grateful for parents who stood by me completely and reminded me that good people still existed, despite what Jenna had done. A few days after my parents' dinner, Alec texted asking if I wanted to grab lunch at this burger place downtown. We met up on a Tuesday afternoon and ordered at the counter before finding a booth near the window. Alec looked at me for a second before he started talking about his own divorce from 5 years ago. His ex-wife had accused him of being emotionally abusive during their custody battle. She told the court he had anger management problems and made her feel unsafe around him. Alec said none of it was true, but her lawyer used every normal argument they'd ever had as evidence of his volatile temper. He ended up losing primary custody of his daughter because the judge believed his ex-wife's version of events. Alec explained that he'd spent years feeling ashamed, like maybe he really had done something wrong even though he knew he hadn't. He said watching me fight back against Jenna's false accusations reminded him that he wasn't crazy for knowing the truth about his own situation. We talked about how society automatically believes accusations without waiting for evidence, and how that default assumption becomes a weapon for manipulative people who know how to exploit it. Alec said his friendship with me through this whole mess had actually helped him process his own experience in a healthier way. I told him his support meant everything to me, especially during those early weeks when I felt completely alone and questioned my own memory of events. We finished our burgers and headed back to work feeling lighter than we had in months. 2 weeks later, I checked my bank account and saw a deposit for $8,000 with a reference number matching the settlement agreement. I stared at the screen for a minute before it really hit me that Jenna had made the first restitution payment. I drove to the bank that afternoon and asked to move the money into my savings account. The teller processed the transfer and handed me a receipt showing the new balance. Depositing that money felt like taking back something that went beyond just the cash itself. Jenna had stolen my sense of security and my ability to trust my own judgment about people. Getting the money back was a tangible step toward rebuilding what she'd destroyed. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot looking at the receipt and feeling a weird mix of relief and sadness. Relief because the financial damage was starting to reverse. Sadness because this money represented 2 years of my life with someone who turned out to be planning to betray me the whole time. I put the receipt in my wallet and drove home. The settlement required monthly payments for the next 6 months until the full $40,000 was repaid. I made a note on my calendar to check for each payment and started thinking about what I'd do once my savings was back to where it should be. Becca called me on a Saturday morning about a month after the sentencing. She asked if we could talk, and I said sure. She apologized for not seeing through Jenna's manipulation sooner. Becca explained that Jenna had been pulling away from friends who questioned her behavior over the past year. Anyone who asked too many questions about the jewelry business or Keith's involvement got slowly frozen out of Jenna's life. That's why Becca didn't know the full extent of what was happening until she saw those texts about getting money from an ex. She said she felt guilty for not pushing harder when things seemed off. I told Becca she had nothing to feel guilty about. I thanked her again for coming forward with the text messages because without that evidence, everything would have been much harder to prove. Those texts were the first concrete proof that Jenna was planning something before the Olive Garden incident even happened. Becca said she was glad she could help and asked how I was doing. We talked for another 20 minutes about normal life stuff, work and hobbies and mutual friends. Before we hung up, we agreed to stay in touch and maybe grab coffee sometime. It felt good to maintain a connection with someone from that part of my life who had actually done the right thing when it mattered. I was at the grocery store picking up stuff for dinner when I ran into Sarah, one of Jenna's close friends from college. She was in the produce section, and our eyes met across the lettuce display. Sarah walked over looking uncomfortable and immediately started apologizing for the harsh things she'd posted on social media supporting Jenna. She said the whole friend group felt foolish now for not questioning the story more critically. Sarah admitted they'd all just assumed Jenna was telling the truth because she was their friend, and women don't lie about abuse. She'd learned a hard lesson about the difference between supporting a friend and participating in destroying someone's reputation without evidence. I told Sarah I understood the instinct to support a friend in crisis. I'd probably have done the same thing if someone I cared about came to me with abuse allegations. But I said I hoped she'd be more careful in the future about joining public accusations without waiting to see proof. Sarah nodded and said she definitely would be. We made awkward small talk for another minute about the weather and then went our separate ways. Walking to the checkout line, I felt oddly okay about the interaction. Sarah had owned her mistake and apologized sincerely. That was more than a lot of people do when they realize they were wrong. Tyler sent me a text 2 days later, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We met at a Starbucks near his office on a Wednesday afternoon. Tyler looked tired when he sat down across from me. He said his whole family had been going to therapy trying to deal with the aftermath of what Jenna did. Their parents were struggling with guilt about not recognizing Keith's bad influence on Jenna sooner. Tyler's mom kept saying she should have seen the warning signs and intervened before things got this far. Tyler explained that his parents wanted to understand what happened from my perspective. He asked if I'd be willing to meet with them to help everyone get some closure. I thought about it for a minute. Part of me wanted nothing to do with Jenna's family ever again, but another part recognized that they were victims of her lies too. I told Tyler I'd be willing to meet with his parents if it would help them process everything. We set up a time for the following week at a coffee shop halfway between our places. Tyler thanked me and said he appreciated me being willing to do this even after everything that happened. I told him I didn't blame his parents for their daughter's choices, and maybe talking would help everyone move forward. The meeting with Jenna's parents happened on a Sunday afternoon at a quiet coffee shop, with big windows and comfortable chairs. Her mom and dad were already sitting at a corner table when I arrived. They both stood up when they saw me, and her mom immediately started crying. They apologized over and over for Tyler's hostile reaction when this all started, and for not questioning Jenna's story more carefully. Her dad said they'd raised Jenna to be honest, and they couldn't understand how she'd turned into someone capable of this kind of manipulation. Her mom kept saying she was sorry through tears. I sat down and told them I didn't blame them for what their daughter chose to do. Parents can't control their adult children's decisions no matter how well they raise them. I explained what had happened from my perspective, walking through the timeline of events and the evidence we'd gathered. They listened quietly and asked a few questions about specific details. Her dad wanted to know if I thought Keith had corrupted Jenna or if she'd always been capable of this. I said honestly I didn't know. Maybe Jenna had always had this side to her and I just never saw it. Or maybe desperation and Keith's influence pushed her into something she wouldn't have done otherwise. We talked for over an hour, and by the end everyone seemed calmer. Her mom hugged me before they left and said she was sorry again. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I hoped they could all find peace with what happened. We parted on good terms with mutual understanding that sometimes bad things happen even in good families. 6 months passed after the restraining order got dismissed. I was doing much better emotionally than I'd been at any point during the whole ordeal. The therapy sessions had helped me process the betrayal without letting it poison my ability to trust people going forward. My therapist and I worked through understanding that Jenna's actions reflected her own character flaws, not some failure in my judgment. I'd started dating casually again, meeting people through apps and friends. I was more cautious now about financial boundaries and watching for red flags in behavior patterns, but I wasn't letting fear stop me from connecting with people. My friends commented that I seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Alex said I smiled more at work and seemed less tense during meetings. My parents noticed the change too when I visited them for dinner. My mom said I looked happier and more relaxed than I had in over a year. I felt like myself again for the first time since the Olive Garden incident. The experience had changed me but not broken me. I'd learned hard lessons about trust and evidence and standing up for the truth. Those lessons made me stronger even though learning them had been painful. The final restitution payment from Jenna hit my bank account on a Thursday morning 6 months after the first one. I logged into my banking app and saw the deposit bringing my savings back to almost exactly where it had been before Jenna started stealing from the joint account. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the balance and feeling something shift inside me. Having all my money back felt like the final chapter closing on this nightmare. The financial damage was repaired. The legal situation was resolved. Jenna was serving her probation and paying her debt to society. I'd done everything I could to fight back and seek justice. Now it was time to actually move forward instead of just recovering. I decided to treat myself to dinner at this Italian restaurant I'd been wanting to try for months. I made a reservation for Friday night and invited Alec to join me. We sat at a table near the window, eating excellent pasta and talking about normal life things like sports and weekend plans. Over dessert, Alec raised his glass and toasted to my resilience and to the good people who'd supported me through everything. I clinked my glass against his and felt genuinely grateful for friends like him who'd stood by me when things were hardest. Detective Watkins called me on a Monday afternoon about 8 months after the sentencing. He said he wanted to update me on Jenna and Keith's compliance with their probation terms. Jenna had completed all her required community service hours and was attending her mandated therapy sessions. She hadn't violated any conditions of her probation. Keith was going to gambling addiction treatment twice a week and had stayed away from casinos completely. His treatment counselor reported that he was taking the program seriously and making progress. Watkins explained that cases like this often ended with the perpetrators reoffending within the first year. The fact that both Jenna and Keith were complying with everything was actually a good sign that they might be taking responsibility for what they'd done. I told Watkins I was glad they were following through with their sentences, even if it took legal force to make them do the right thing. He said he'd keep monitoring their progress and would let me know if anything changed. I thanked him for the update and hung up feeling oddly satisfied. Justice had been served, and the people who tried to destroy my life were facing real consequences. That was all I could reasonably ask for. Alec mentioned a job opening at his company one afternoon when we were getting coffee in the break room. The position was in a different department with better pay and less stress than my current role. He said he'd put in a good word for me if I wanted to apply. I updated my resume that night and submitted an application the next morning. 2 weeks later, I got called in for an interview. The hiring manager seemed impressed with my experience, and I felt good about how the conversation went. They offered me the position 3 days later with a salary increase and better benefits. I accepted immediately and put in my notice at my current job. Starting fresh at a new company felt like the perfect next step. My new coworkers didn't know anything about what I'd been through with Jenna and the false accusations. I could just be a regular person doing good work without the shadow of that whole nightmare hanging over me. On my first day at the new job, I introduced myself to my team and dove into learning the systems and processes. Nobody asked about my personal life or why I'd left my previous company. I was just the new guy who seemed competent and friendly. That anonymity felt wonderful after months of being defined by the worst experience of my life. A few weeks after starting my new job, I saw a flyer at the coffee shop near my apartment, advertising volunteer opportunities with a legal aid organization that helped people facing false accusations. I wrote down the phone number and called that evening to ask about getting involved. The coordinator said they needed volunteers who could share their experiences and help others navigate similar situations. I scheduled an orientation meeting for the following week and showed up feeling nervous but ready to turn what happened with Jenna into something useful. The organization paired me with people who were dealing with fraudulent restraining orders or false claims, and I walked them through the documentation strategies that had worked for me. Helping someone else gather bank records and text message evidence to prove their innocence felt like taking back power from what Jenna had tried to do to me. One guy I worked with was facing accusations from his ex-wife, who was trying to gain leverage in a custody battle, and I spent hours showing him how to organize a timeline and collect witness statements. When his restraining order got dismissed 3 months later, he called to thank me and said my help had saved his relationship with his kids. That moment made all the pain I'd gone through feel worth something bigger than just my own story. Tyler reached out about grabbing lunch one Saturday afternoon, which surprised me since we hadn't talked much since everything went down with Jenna. We met at a burger place downtown, and he apologized again for how he'd reacted initially when Jenna made her accusations. He said watching the whole situation unfold had completely changed how he thought about believing accusations without evidence. Tyler told me he'd been reading about false allegations and due process, and he wanted to do something to help other families avoid the damage his family had experienced. We talked for 2 hours about starting a support group for families affected by false accusations from both sides, where people could share their experiences and learn from each other. He said his parents would probably want to be involved too, since they felt terrible about how quickly they'd believe Jenna without asking questions. We exchanged numbers and agreed to meet monthly for lunch or to catch a game, which felt weird but also good. Tyler had become an unlikely friend through the worst experience of my life, and our friendship reminded me that good things could come from terrible situations if you stayed open to them. I called up some friends I'd drifted away from during my relationship with Jenna and suggested we get together for drinks. Mark and Chris showed up at the bar, and we spent the first hour catching up on their lives before they asked how I was doing after everything. Mark admitted they'd both thought Jenna was isolating me from friends, but didn't know how to bring it up without causing problems. Chris said he'd noticed I stopped showing up to game nights and always had excuses about being busy with Jenna's jewelry business stuff. They both felt guilty for not saying something sooner, but I told them I probably wouldn't have listened anyway since I was convinced everything was fine. We made plans to start a weekly game night again and to stay in better touch going forward. Having that friend group back reminded me how important it was to maintain relationships outside of romantic ones. Mark joked that they'd be doing background checks on anyone I dated in the future, and we all laughed, but there was some truth to it. These were people who genuinely cared about my well-being and would speak up if they saw red flags, which felt valuable after missing so many warning signs with Jenna. On what would have been our 3-year anniversary, I woke up expecting to feel sad or angry, but instead felt grateful. I made coffee and sat on my balcony thinking about how different my life would be if I'd married Jenna like I'd been planning to do. We talked about getting engaged that year, and I'd been saving up for a ring before everything exploded. If the truth hadn't come out when it did, I might have married someone who was actively stealing from me and planning to extort me for money. I felt grateful the whole scheme fell apart before we had kids or bought a house together. I was grateful for people like Becca who came forward with evidence even though it was uncomfortable. I was grateful for Tyler's eventual support and for friends like Alec who stood by me without hesitation. Most of all, I was grateful I'd fought back instead of just paying the $50,000 to make the problem disappear. Taking the easy way out would have let Jenna and Keith get away with their scheme and probably encouraged them to try it again with someone else. Fighting back had been exhausting and scary, but it taught me that integrity and evidence matter more than convenience or comfort. I got a message through the legal aid organization from someone named Dustin who said he'd heard about my case and needed advice. He was facing false accusations from his girlfriend who claimed he'd been abusive, and he had evidence suggesting she was lying to get money from him. I called Dustin that evening, and we talked for over an hour about the steps I'd taken to prove the truth. I walked him through the importance of documenting everything, saving all communications and gathering financial records before they could be destroyed. Dustin said his girlfriend had been acting weird lately and picking fights over nothing, which sounded exactly like what Jenna had done to build her case. I told him to hire a good lawyer immediately and to start working with a private investigator to trace where money was going. He thanked me multiple times and said talking to someone who'd been through something similar gave him hope that he could fight back successfully. After we hung up, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't expected. Sharing my story and the strategies that worked could actually protect other innocent people from the same kind of manipulation I'd faced. My parents hosted a family dinner a few weeks later to celebrate my new job and fresh start. My brother and sister showed up with their families, and we all sat around the dining room table eating my mom's famous lasagna. My sister joked that she was going to run full background checks on anyone I dated from now on, and my brother said he'd personally interview them before I could make things official. Everyone laughed, and I felt genuinely happy, surrounded by people who'd never doubted me, even when things looked bad. My dad raised his glass and toasted to family standing together through hard times, and my mom got teary talking about how proud she was of how I'd handled everything. My nephew asked what we were celebrating, and my sister told him Uncle was starting an exciting new job, which was a simpler explanation than the whole truth. The evening reminded me that family support was invaluable during the hardest moments of life. These were people who would always have my back no matter what happened, and that foundation made it possible to rebuild after everything Jenna had tried to destroy. I booked a solo vacation to a beach town in Florida to clear my head and process everything that had happened over the past year. I spent my days walking along the shore, and my evenings sitting on the balcony of my rental watching the sunset. One evening I sat there with a beer thinking about how much had changed since that anniversary dinner at Olive Garden when Jenna ran to the bathroom crying. The whole nightmare had been horrible and painful, but I'd survived it with my integrity intact. I was stronger than I'd thought, and more resilient than I'd known before being tested. The experience had taught me to trust evidence over emotions and to stand up for myself even when it was scary and expensive. I thought about where I'd be if I'd just paid the $50,000 like Jenna wanted, and I realized I'd probably still be looking over my shoulder wondering if she'd come back for more. Fighting back had been the right choice even though it was hard. I finished my beer and watched the sun disappear below the horizon, feeling ready to move forward without anger or bitterness weighing me down. A year after the restraining order was dismissed, I was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. My new job was going great, and my boss had already mentioned potential for advancement. I'd started dating someone I met through friends, and the relationship felt healthy and honest in ways my time with Jenna never had. Sarah respected boundaries and communicated directly instead of playing games or manufacturing drama. We were taking things slowly since I was still working through trust issues with my therapist, but I felt optimistic about where things might go. My therapist said I'd done remarkable work processing the trauma and rebuilding my ability to trust people. She pointed out that I'd maintained my core values throughout the ordeal instead of becoming bitter or cynical. I was still volunteering with the legal aid organization and had helped 3 more people successfully fight false accusations. Life felt genuinely good for the first time in over a year, and I was excited about the future instead of dreading what might happen next. I received a letter from Jenna's probation officer confirming she'd completed all requirements of her sentence successfully. There was a brief handwritten note from Jenna tucked inside, apologizing again for what she'd put me through and saying she was in therapy working on her issues. She wrote that she understood if I never wanted to hear from her again, but wanted me to know she took full responsibility for her actions. I read the note twice, then put it in a drawer without responding. I appreciated the apology, but had no desire to reconnect or maintain any kind of relationship with her. Some chapters needed to stay closed for both people to move forward in healthy ways. Jenna was dealing with her consequences and hopefully becoming a better person, but that journey didn't need to include me. I hoped she actually learned from what happened and never tried to hurt someone else the way she'd hurt me. But her future wasn't my responsibility anymore. The legal aid organization asked me to speak at a conference about false accusations and the importance of evidence-based justice. I spent a week preparing a presentation that walked through my experience and the strategies that helped me prove the truth. Standing in front of 200 lawyers, advocates, and people who'd faced similar situations felt surreal. I told them about the Olive Garden incident and the restraining order, about finding Becca's texts and hiring Jarrett and Georgia to build my case. I explained how documentation and evidence had saved me from a scheme that could have destroyed my life financially and reputationally. Several attendees thanked me afterward, including a family law attorney who said she'd use my case as an example when teaching clients about protecting themselves. A woman approached me crying and said her son was facing false accusations, and my story gave her hope they could fight back successfully. Turning my painful experience into education and advocacy felt like the best possible outcome from everything I'd been through. My phone buzzed one afternoon with a text from Tyler that I hadn't expected. Keith had been sober from gambling for over a year now and was rebuilding his life slowly. He was working a regular job at a warehouse and paying back money to other people he'd hurt along the way. Tyler said Keith asked about me sometimes and wondered if I'd ever want to talk. I read the message twice before responding that I was glad Keith was getting help, but I had no interest in reconnecting. Some relationships needed to stay in the past for everyone's sake. Tyler understood and said he respected my boundaries. I appreciated him reaching out but felt no pull to revisit that chapter of my life. Keith's recovery was his own journey and didn't need to include me. 2 years after everything began, I barely recognized my life compared to where I'd been. My job was challenging and rewarding in ways my old position never was. I had friends who actually knew me, and relationships built on honesty instead of hidden agendas. The apartment I'd moved into after leaving the place Jenna and I shared felt like home in a way that old space never had. Sarah and I had been together for 8 months, and she knew the whole story without judgment. We talked openly about money and boundaries and never played games with each other. My therapist said I'd done remarkable work processing everything and rebuilding my ability to trust people. The experience taught me that truth and evidence win out over manipulation when you're willing to fight for what's right. I was grateful for everyone who believed in me when it would have been easier to assume the worst. I was proud of myself for not rolling over and becoming another victim of a scheme designed to destroy me. Life felt genuinely good now in ways I hadn't imagined possible during those dark weeks after the restraining order. I was excited about the future instead of afraid of what might come next.